Genesis 13, 5 through 9. I'm just about to throw a rock at that thing. Zion, you're really tall. Go over there and pull that chain like one time, and it changes the speed. The fan in the middle. You should get Sean because he doesn't even have to just, it's like 7 foot tall. There you go. That's good. Now I can focus. See, this is a combination by eating too much food before I came, and that noise is just overwhelming. Can't concentrate. Verse 5 says, Now Lot was moving about with Abram. Also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were unable to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. So we see Abram, he now begins to move forward. In essence, he moved backwards. I like the way it says he goes down to Egypt. He went down away from the Lord. Now he's repentant, and now he's moving once again in a forward motion. That's the direction we need to be moving as believers. Many times we're either standing still, which is normally not the case. We're usually going backwards. You guys know the illustration. It's like riding up this mountain road here. If you stop pedaling, what happens? You usually fall down or go backwards. Unless you get off the bike, which I recommend the best. But if you stop pedaling, you're going to go backwards. So in your same walk as a Christian, you always want to be going forward. So now we see Abram beginning to make movement forward. But as he begins to move, what always happens when you begin to serve the Lord? Something is there to hinder you. Well, there's an issue that arises. It's kind of interesting. The issue that arises is that Abram and Lot both gained a lot of wealth and a lot of livestock. Sounds like a problem, huh? They become very wealthy. But because they had so much livestock, being together, the land could not sustain both of them. This caused tension. Remember, we understand that the herdsmen for Lot, the herdsmen for Abram, their job was to take care of their flock, to take care of the animals. So can you understand the tension? Because it was impossible. The food was being eaten up by one set of livestock over the other. So you can see the conflict because I can't do my job right because there's not enough food here. So the tension, you're like, let's get our herd there before Abrams gets there or Lot. So you see the tension and arguments begin to happen between these two groups. And here's what I believe this stems from. Now, it may not sound like it. They sound greatly blessed, right? But I believe this incident happens because of disobedience. Disobedience is not without consequences, is it? Remember when Abram was told by God to leave Ur of the Chaldean, what did God tell him? Leave your family. He didn't say, bring your nephew Lot with him. But yet, he didn't completely obey God. And he leaves out with his nephew Lot. And now, because of that, he's having to deal with this problem of too many animals. He's dealing with the consequences of disobedience. Now, this is actually going to escalate as we continue through Genesis. You're going to see. When we disobey God, He will forgive us, but it doesn't mean that the consequences will stop there. When you put things into action, they will continue to happen, unless God determines to stop them. Just like later on, Abram is going to have to deal with his disobedience going into Egypt. Remember we just talked about it? With his maidservant, Hagar. That's going to be an issue that even though he went back and repented to God, he's brought her with him. And that's going to cause issues later. So Abram and Lot see that their servants are fighting, having disagreements. And then it makes a statement. It says, they were in the land of the Canaanites and Perizzites. Now, why did they throw that out there? Well, you have these people are watching Abram and Lot. And what are they seeing? These are people of the world. They're seeing Abram and Lot that are supposed to be following God. And what does he see? Like what he sees. What are you seeing among different Christians, different churches? They're fighting with each other. They're just standing there like, wow, they act just like us. They're no different than us. And Abram is saying, you know, we shouldn't be fighting like this. We need to take care of this issue now. And many people will never listen to us as believers because of what some other believers do. For example, televangelists. They think we're all like that. Do you believe that? A lot of non-Christians look at that and say, you all are like that. I'm like, you know, I don't like them either. I've told you, I've called them before. Don't ever do it. Again, it's a waste of time. It's like they keep saying, send me your money. You guys ever, does that irritate you? Send me your money because our ministry will end if you don't. So I'm yelling at the TV and I'm like, yeah, it should. Because that didn't work, I called them. I'm like, I don't know what God you're serving, but it's not mine. Well, they're very well trained and you're wasting your time. It didn't make me, well, I did feel a little bit better. But see, they look at those and that's what they're saying. So as Christians, we need to live in a way that truly represents God. So look at your own life. I can look at my life and see how, you know, I've fallen short, how I've been a bad example, how I've blown up in anger, how I've been mad at a person forever, and people see that. How I respond to difficulties sometimes like the world. So Abram, he says, you know, I don't want quarreling among us. We're family. Man, it seems like families where you get a lot of quarreling going on, huh? He says, so out of love, I believe out of generosity, Abram tells Lot this. He says, if you want to go left, if you want to take the land to the left, take it, and I'll go to the right. But if you want to go right, I'll go left. Whichever land you want, I'll take what you don't want. That sounds pretty amazing, doesn't it? To be able to respond, says, you know what? Take whatever you want. I'll take whatever left over. But keep this in mind. I do believe Abram still held on to God's promise. God said, I will give you the promised land. He's like, dude, take whatever land you want. God's already promised me some land. So he really didn't need to worry. Because he trusted God. Because, listen to this part, because he trusted God, he was able to be generous. Many times we're stingy because we don't trust God. If I give this last dollar to this person, I can't get something from McDonald's. You really don't need to eat it anyway, but you start to sweat because this is your last few dollars and you don't want to help someone. But because he trusted God, he was able to be generous to his nephew Lot. How does Lot respond to Abram's generosity? Now, here's the thing. Before we get into this, realize you got to do what God has called you to do and don't worry about the results. Because when we see what Lot does, I don't think we're going to like it. When we are generous to people, we begin to, well, what are they going to do with it? Maybe they're going to squander what I've helped them with. If God has called you to do it, just do it. The result's up to him. Let's look at the next three verses. Genesis 13, verses 10 through 13. So he tells him, whichever way you want, land you want. So what does Lot do? He says, Lot looked around. Can you see Lot? He's looking around thinking, And listen to what he says. And saw that the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, like the world they just came out of. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So, yeah, because he's looking down towards Sodom and Gomorrah. He's, man, that is beautiful. It is now. You can't see the future. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan. What is the land of Canaan? The promised land. Right in the area where the promised land. While Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tent near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So Lot hears his uncle say, hey, whatever you want. Take whichever you want. And this is kind of what the world will do. They'll look and say, I'm going to take the best for myself. Is that not what he did? He says, that's the green pastures down there. What he doesn't realize down at the end is Sodom and Gomorrah. Pretty soon all that green is going to be brown. And God's going to wipe it out. But what we see is that he's saying, here's also a key point. He says, it reminds me of the garden of the Lord of Egypt. So it must have been very luscious. And he's thinking from the perspective of a shepherd owning animals that he could raise his animals on. So he sees it's lush, perfect for raising animals. He only cared for materialistic things, abundance of the land. And he didn't care to know how it would impact him or his family spiritually. See, there's an important thing. We need to, before we make step out and make decisions, do things that change the direction of our life, we need to seek the Lord first, because we don't know how it's going to affect us spiritually. But God does, doesn't he? He said, let's seek the Lord first. And he may say, you know what, neither one of us need to go that direction by Sodom and Gomorrah. But no, he just looked and he saw. Isn't that what kind of draws us into sin? We look with our eyes and we're drawn into it. It's like, wow, I'm going there. That looks, what did it say? The grass is greener in the other pastures. That's what he was seeing. He's like, man, that's looking awesome. Faith means we do not walk by what we see, but we walk knowing to be true in God. For example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7 says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." This is what Lot was doing. He was walking by sight. Abram was walking by faith. He's like, dude, take wherever you want. I'm going to listen. Really, after going to Egypt, he's thinking, I'm going to listen to what direction God wants me to go. If you take wherever you want, I'm going to go wherever he tells me to go. So it tells us, Lot pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. Man, he couldn't just stop halfway in the middle. He pitches it right by Sodom, and it says it was a wicked people. And really think about this too. I don't think it would take long for him to figure out that they were wicked. But he also looked with his eyes and he could see the worldly riches, and he more than likely desired them. It was kind of right outside of Sodom, but later Lot becomes a leader in the sinful city. You guys remember later on it says Lot sits out in the city gates. You know what that means? When they would sit on the front in the city gates, that's where the judges of the city would come together and make decisions. So we hear later on that's where Lot's sitting. City Hall, man. He's sitting in City Hall and he's making decisions with these wicked people. He's valuing only the things that he can see that will increase his wealth temporarily. Now, we've kind of learned in the last few years that, maybe more of us have learned in more years, is that wealth comes and goes, doesn't it? We see these people are rich and the market crashes, the housing market crashes. People are killing themselves because one day they're rich and the next day they're not. And they can't live without it. But Lot will lose it all. There's a good example for us not to seek after worldly riches. Doesn't mean God can't give them to us, but that should not be our first priority. How many people do you know that their whole life has been around gaining wealth? They're one of the most miserable people to be around because they have no friends. Because after time, people figure out, you're no friend of mine. You're no friend to anyone but yourself. Let's go ahead and look at verses 14 through 18. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him. Now listen to what God says. He says, look around from where you are to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. So we see here God wants to talk to Abram alone after Lot leaves. Remember, the promise was for Abram, it wasn't for Lot, was it? He says, leave your family, leave everything, leave your land, and I will make you into a great nation. Not Lot. So what we see here, God restates again his promise to Abram. But he's not only telling him about the promised land, but he's telling him about the descendants, but he's also giving the vision. Look around. This is the land that I will give you. See, Abram didn't demand his own way. Sometimes we think we got to demand our way. But Abram didn't. He trusted in the Lord, didn't he? And look what happened. What God is saying here, you hear what God just said? He says, the north and the south, east and the west. Which way did Lot go? He went to the east. He says, you may have let him take that land, but I'm saying it's still yours. Everything that you can see. So Abram lost nothing, did he? He says, I've given all this belongs to you. Even today, when people says this land doesn't belong to Israel, because Israel is not occupying the land that God has given them. They're not even close to what all it's supposed to be theirs. So when country's saying Israel should give it up, God said, I don't care what you say. I'm telling you it belongs to Israel, to my people. I promise that to them forever. So I love this because God's being visual with Abram. Abram's like me. It really helps me out when I see the pictures, when I see, and I think that's what's helping him here to encourage him. And still, he's like, what, I think in his 80s? He doesn't have kids yet. And once again, God says, your children will be like, what's the words he used? Because I want to think of the beach, but it's more the sand. Like the sand that's blown on the mountains out here. Can you imagine counting those things? Man, I just don't even get close to this. But he's saying, it's like that. That's how, he's saying, if you could count them. In other words, your descendants are going to be so numerous, no one's going to be able to count them. So again, it's an act of reminding him, trust in me. What I said will happen. Let's go ahead and move on to chapter 14. And here I will show you a couple slides. I'm going to try to stop as we go. Let's look at verse 1. At this time, Amphel, king of Shinar, Arok, king of Elasar, Kedalamar, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goam, went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Berja, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shimber, king of Zeboim, and king of Bela, which is by Zor. Now pull up slide number 3. We're going to see on slide 3, all these see Elam, the king of Elam is the big guy. Apparently that's why they made the letters bigger. He's like the main king. This king has had all these kingdoms over here under servitude to him, and we're going to see it's been for quite a while. So they are eventually, Elam, the king of Elam, is going to get all these 3 kings together with him, come to war against these 5 kings. Let's go on and read the rest. He says, all these latter kings, speaking of the 5 kings, joined forces in the valley of Siddim. Right there when he moved it. Right down in here, where they're already gathered, this is the valley of Siddim. They're all going to come together there, and we'll see in a few minutes where they're going to come against this king of Elam. Verse 3 says, all these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, by the Salt Sea, which is the Dead Sea. Listen to this part. For 12 years they had been subject to Kedalamar, but in the 13th year they rebelled. So 12 years, king of Elam had put them under servitude to him. They had to pay him money or whatever it was, whatever he demanded for 12 years. He says, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedalamar and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Raphites, the Asaracanim, the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shaviv, Kirathim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, and as far as Paran near the desert. And I'll point that out to you here in a couple minutes. Then they turned back and went to En-Misfat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, the Amorites, who were living in Hazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, marched out and drew their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedalamar, king of Elam. Tidal, king of Goim, Amphel, king of Shinar, Arok, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of them fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. Now let's look at this map again. So what's interesting, because they've rebelled, think about this, 5 kings come against 4. As they come over, and I think the route you'll see usually comes up like this, up and around, and what happens, they hit these small nations. And as they were going through these nations, they wiped them out as they went through. Because of their rebellion, these guys they went through there and they took what they wanted. They took any supplies. So they went through there. And then these 5 kings come together, and then they come out and attack these 4 kings. So these 5 kings, what I just told you about, they call the Jordanian Plain. That's where these guys are from, in this area through here. These guys are the kings from the east. 12 years servitude. The 13th year, they basically said, we've had enough. It's not only enough to say, I've had enough, but they believe the strength of 5 kingdoms was enough to beat this king of Elam. Now, I'm sure they knew that this king would get these other kingdoms to support him. So they believe us as 5 kings, 5 kingdoms could beat 4. Numbers sound like it, right? So they join these forces, come down through, wipe out these other areas. They wipe out the Amorites, Amalekites as well. So it says they come out, these 4 kings come out and come against them. And when they come up in this area here, it said there was like tar pits. And it says as the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah, as apparently they were being defeated. They weren't strong enough, so they began to flee. But many of them fell into these tar pits. And the ones that didn't fall into tar pits escaped to the hills. So what does that tell you? That means that there was no one left to protect Sodom and Gomorrah. There was no one left to protect those 4 kingdoms. So these guys ransack there, they here wipe these guys out, and then they go down and ransack these other towns. And that's where they find Lot. His nephew Lot is outside of Sodom. He takes him and all his possessions off into captivity. Let's look at verse 13 through 17. A man who had escaped and came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great tree of Mamre, the Amorite, and I'll show you that picture in a minute, a brother of Eshcol and Anar, and all who were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out, listen to this number, 318 trained men born in his household. That sounds like a lot of men trained for battle. And he went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hoboth, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, and together with the women and the other people. After Abram returned from defeating Gildamer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shevev, that is the king's valley. Now this is the first mention or use of the word Hebrew in the Bible. The word Hebrew comes from the root meaning that means to be passed over. You remember when they were delivered out of Egypt? Passed over. And the Septuagint translated as passenger. So what happens is there's a guy from the, let's go back to that map. Someone survived the attack, which you figure several probably survived. This one man knows and are actually allied with Abram. He goes back and tells them they have taken your nephew Lot into captivity. Now Abram does something that's amazing. He calls 318 men that had been trained for battle. Now, for him, that sounds like that's a lot of people. But now, let's put it in context of 5 kingdoms. I think there's got to be a lot more than 318. But what he does, he goes and attacks them. Remember, they're victorious. They're having all the spoils from this whole region, from here all the way down. They have people, animals, stock, food, gold, everything from these kingdoms. So at night, I don't think they were expecting anyone to attack. They've wiped out everyone in their path. So Abram attacks them at night. He divides up the 318 into two different teams. Great confusion. We know he's victorious, and one of the main reasons he's victorious, why do you think that he was victorious? God. God's with him. Be like, okay, Lot, you chose it. Sorry, nephew, because that's what you get, right? Told you so. No, he didn't do that. He goes back, he rescues Lot, and recovers all his plunder, all the stuff that they took away from him, all his goods that the 5 kings had plundered and taken. So he not only brings Lot back, but all his things that he had, he brings them back. But one thing is interesting about Lot. Remember, Sodom and Gomorrah hasn't been destroyed by God yet, right? So that means Lot has to return back to Sodom. Did Lot not learn his lesson? He didn't learn his lesson, so therefore he goes back to Sodom, and eventually he's going to lose everything. Abram goes with him, brings his family back and all his stuff back with him for him to go back into the world. Basically, it's like us going, learning what God has done for us and go back into the world. I don't know if we can really say much positive about Lot. I'm just going to leave it there because I think it's a great picture of many of us. We serve the Lord. He rescues us. Lord, just get me out of this. I'll be at church every Sunday. You ever say that? Or you ever heard someone say that? Oh, my life is yours, Lord. And then when he delivers you, you're like, well, I didn't really mean it that literally. I kind of meant I would go sometimes. Anyway, apparently that's what he did. Let's go ahead and look at Genesis 14, verses 18 through 24. This actually wraps up the section. I went through this pretty quickly. He says, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram, saying, blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. So now we know, he's saying, God is the one that delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. The king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. But Abram said this to the king of Sodom. Abram's totally separated himself from this wicked king. He says, with raised hands I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of the heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me. To Anar, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them have their share. Melchizedek, you guys have heard of him before, right? He's mentioned briefly here and there. We have no idea where he came from. He said king of Salem. I don't think that was even mentioned until all of a sudden the battle's over. It says, here comes Melchizedek. How he came to be in Canaan, we don't know. But it says he's a king, and he also says he's a priest of the true God. Now, there's a case where one king tried to make himself a priest. God was not going for that. But yet, in this sentence, he is a king and a priest. Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace. It sounds, by this brief introduction of him, it sounds like an obscure person that's not very important. Through the Old Testament, we have different names. Even in the New Testament, a name will be mentioned briefly and no details. And it's like, well, apparently it was important. But this man is. In Psalm 110:4 it says, the priesthood of the Messiah is a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, as opposed to being in the order of Aaron. Remember, Aaron is the established priesthood. They follow through him. But this is a higher priesthood through Melchizedek. And is also spoke of in Hebrews chapter 5 through 7. But in Hebrews 7 verse 3 it describes Melchizedek without a father, without a mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. So because of this passage, some of them believe it's appearance of Jesus. What's the word? Christophany? I don't know what the fancy word is, but Jesus appearing in the Old Testament. I like that one better because I can say it. And here's another little tidbit that was interesting. It says, as Melchizedek's name means righteousness, Jesus is our righteousness. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 30. And Salem means peace, and Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And it says Melchizedek has no beginning and no end. Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. And Melchizedek was a priest. Jesus is our great high priest. So many believe this is a appearing of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Briefly mentioned, but referred to again in the Psalms and Hebrews. So we see, even as Abram chose to be humble, chose to let his nephew Lot choose the best. Now, take from this. Many times we have differences with people. We say the best thing I can do is take what's best for me. I'm going to take all I can, and like the world does. What does the world do? They fight for it. We got to trust in the Lord and say, you know what, God? Let them take whatever they want. I'm going to trust in you. And how does it end? If you trust in the Lord, He will bless you and He will provide you. He will take you where you need to be. Imagine if Abram, I don't think he would have done the same thing Lot has done, but he could be challenged if he lived down there by Sodom. He was out close to Sodom. Next thing you know, Lot's right at the gates of Sodom in the leadership. In other words, you can't mess with the world. Try to be close to the world, but not in the world. I'm going to try to get that fine line. I'm going to live that fine line. I'm going to be right there. It's almost a sin, not quite. But you're putting yourself in danger. In a sense of, when you see sin, you should run from it. You should get as far as you can from it. Sin that entices you. And I think the biggest thing I'm really getting out of this is trust in God. Trust in God and seek Him first. How many of you guys do that all the time? None of you guys do it all the time. Well, maybe there's one of you. Do you guys, anyone here do it all the time? First thought is, God, before I jump out in my own flesh and here's what we're going to do, I'm going to seek you first. I usually back up a day later and thinking, dang, I wish I'd asked God first. Because He has, remember, we're looking many times from a physical perspective, right? We need to be looking at things from a spiritual perspective. And the only way to do that is look at it through God's eyes. So with that, we're going to end here. I cannot believe I went through 2 chapters like that. Just pretty quick. I didn't hesitate on the names because no one here can say it. If you do, I don't want to know. I could have did it. Doesn't matter how many times I practice, it sounds good every time, right? It sounds terrible. But let's end with a word of prayer and let's go into prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this night, for this evening, as we look at the life of Abram, as we continue to look at his life. It can give us so many examples, Lord, so many ways that we need to trust and have faith in you. Stop seeking the wisdom of the world, but to seek and trust in you first and know that you have a plan for us, that your plan is more than just meeting our physical needs, that you want to change us spiritually, that you want to bless us spiritually to be more like your Son. So open our hearts, our minds, give us that understanding. Give us the ability to stop before we make decisions and seek your wisdom and guidance. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.